Previously on Ghost Whisperer.
It's called a money plane. Some of the baddest motherfuckers on the planet are on that plane, all craving action. Whatever you want to wager on, the money plane has you covered. You want to bet on a dude fucking an alligator? Money plane.
People of Earth, how are you?
Broadcasting live to tape from the Society Theater in the dirtiest city in the world, outside of Italy, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You're listening to the podcast of a world gone mad. This is The Society Show.
You know, we're living in a society.
On today's episode, the United States coronavirus has reached 44 9/11s. That's right, over 44 times as many people have died from coronavirus as died in 9/11. That's up 2 full 9/11s since last episode. Protests have still seized the United States. Very little has tangibly changed since the protests started, and now mainstream media is hardly talking about it. Meanwhile, the brands are all advocating for Black Lives Matter. Old shows are being removed and people are getting canceled. And while some of these things are good, for example, there's really no excuse that Aunt Jemima was still on pancake syrup bottles. But what discourse is morphing into is the right wing is absolutely outraged about their prize statues and prize pancake syrup being taken from them. The right wing is getting their grubby hands all over the political moment and reducing it down to their petty culture wars. So this episode I'll talk about some international news, as I usually do, as always, but I'm going to dive deeper into some more culture war issues. Remember, culture wars are a tool by the right wing to delegitimize actual political and economic discussion. Because of this, I see it as one of my goals to disabuse the US of its favorite pastime, pointless culture war bickering. That's right, this is the culture war episode. As much as I don't want to do it, we gotta talk about it. The world has truly gone mad, so let's get into the Society Show.
Society.
But first, it's the Facts and Logic Report.
Facts don't care about your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. These are facts.
Ghislaine Maxwell, the alleged accomplice of Jeffrey Epstein, was charged by federal prosecutors for her alleged role in recruiting, grooming, and sexually abusing underage girls as part of a years-long criminal enterprise. She was arrested by the FBI in a small New Hampshire town where she was hiding.
He's a licensed federal booby inspector.
Maria Farmer was the first person to file a criminal complaint against Jeffrey Epstein. In the media, she has claimed that Eileen Guggenheim of the New York Academy of Art forced her to sell her art to Jeffrey Epstein at a discount price, Following this, Epstein went on to try to abuse both Maria Farmer and her sister. Now, the New York Academy of Art has hired lawyers to release a report for them, saying that Epstein's victims are lying. The statement attempts to vindicate Eileen Guggenheim by smearing and victim-blaming Maria Farmer.
An artist respects the silence. It serves as the foundation of creativity.
Panicked Elon Musk has began distancing himself from Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. He now claims that the photo of him with Ghislaine Maxwell was actually supposed to just be a photo of himself, and she photobombed him.
Sure, Jan.
He's also now claiming it's a lie that Epstein toured the SpaceX facility.
Sure, Jan.
He's also downplaying the reports that he introduced Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk. He visited Epstein's Manhattan mansion at least once, but now he claims he was only there for a half hour with his wife so she could research a novel she was writing.
Sure, Jan.
Elon Musk has denied that he meant to call a British cave diver a paedophile when he dubbed the guy Pedo Guy on social media.
Germany's defense minister has announced that they would partially disband their most elite military special forces group called Kommando Spezialkräfte. They are disbanding it because one of the 4 companies within the group is overrun with far-right extremists. The defense minister blamed, quote, toxic leadership who, quote, developed and promoted extremist tendencies. In Denmark, a black man was killed by 2 white men. At least one of them had visible Nazi tattoos, and the other was, at the very least, very vocally in favor of extreme right positions. However, the state prosecutor is not considering it a racial attack because the victims apparently knew the neo-Nazis who killed him. Yeah, apparently you can't be racist if you know the person you killed in a racist attack. You can only be racist to strangers.
Are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
Amsterdam's red light district reopens after coronavirus with some minor restrictions. Among those restrictions is no kissing allowed.
Kim's the first girl I kissed.
Italian police seized over $1 billion of what they claim is ISIS-made amphetamines.
What about drugs? You doing some of that crack cocaine? You on the pipe?
Mike Pompeo of the United States is urging Turkey not to convert Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Currently, Hagia Sophia, in the past, it was a church, became a mosque, and now it's a museum. The Turkish state did not like this very much and told America to butt out of domestic issues. Gilgit-Baltistan is a region of Kashmir administered by Pakistan. Currently, there's been conflict between India and Pakistan over Muslim majority, but India-administered Jammu and Kashmir. So, Gilgit-Baltistan is administered by Pakistan. Jammu and Kashmir is administered by India. However, both countries claim both regions as their own. As Pakistan continues to plan an election in Gilgit-Baltistan next month, India is trying to ratchet up tension by demanding the election be cancelled and the region be given to India.
Go on, leave, get out!
Meanwhile, India's Hindu nationalist president, Modi, has been highlighting the history of Buddhism in India to get majority Buddhist countries more sympathetic to India and consequently increase tension with India's rival, China. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. The RCMP in Canada, otherwise known as Mounties, charged the Canadian Armed Forces reservist Corey Huron with a slew of firearm charges for allegedly ramming his truck through the gates at Rideau Hall, which is where Justin Trudeau lives in Ottawa. He was charged with 4 counts of careless use of a firearm, 4 counts of illegal transporting of a firearm, 4 counts of possession of a weapon for a dangerous reason, 1 count of possession of a prohibited devices, 4 counts of possession of a restricted firearm with ammunition, and 1 count of uttering threats. Most alarming, however, is this armed military man posted QAnon content on social media. The day before, he rammed the gates with guns in his car. An anti-Trudeau rally took place in Ottawa. While the rally was about a variety of subjects, including pushing back on COVID-19 safety measures, many of the attendees were QAnon conspiracy theorists. It's not clear if he was at the rally or if he was connected, but it's certainly a big coincidence.
Because if there's a Canadian, there has to be a Tim's.
I talk about Peter Thiel a lot on the show. He's a scumbag. The main reason I talk about him is Palantir, which may be his biggest company, but he has more. This story coming from Bloomberg. Anduril Industries Incorporated, a Southern California startup that builds technology for military agencies and border surveillance, said it raised a new funding round, nearly doubling the company's valuation of $1.9 billion. It says Silicon Valley money has rapidly propelled the 3-year-old company, blah, blah, blah. Anduril builds surveillance towers and drones, along with software to automatically monitor areas like international borders and the perimeter of military bases. The problem with Peter Thiel is he wants a society completely run by capitalists. He wants the entire state to be outsourced to capitalists. Particularly him, and that would be the darkest reality possible. This isn't just me speculating either based on his behavior. This is actually what he believes. He's really good friends with Curtis Yarvin, who is most known for being a close associate with Nick Land after he took his far-right turn. If you don't know Nick Land, he was a philosopher in the 90s. He still exists, but he took a ton of amphetamines and designer drugs, rotted out his brain, and became a far-right boomer, basically.
What about drugs? You doing some of that crack cocaine? You on the pipe?
Curtis Yarvin was one of his closest, I guess, intellectual allies after he took his far-right turn. Curtis Yarvin is known for being an ideologue who wants to move the world, especially America, into what he calls a neo-cameral system. An original cameral system existed, I think, in the German Empire under Bismarck. I don't really know, but it's some system in the German Empire, but I think it was under Bismarck.
Editor's note: cameralism predates Otto von Bismarck. It was an academic political idea that was trendy in the 1700s into the 1800s. politicians, primarily in Prussia, but to some extent Sweden, would implement and use some of these ideas. But there was never a quintessential example of full-blown cameralism.
What he wants to do is turn society into a giant corporation. The government would be the leaders of the corporation, and we don't get to vote. The shareholders might vote, but the country would operate exactly like a giant corporation. And that's kind of even a charitable definition, because there is a lot of, as you would imagine from far-right thinking, ethno-nationalist elements to it, racist elements. Shocker, right? Well, Peter Thiel is very publicly friends with Curtis Yarvin. They share investments with each other, and if you hear when Peter Thiel talks about his personal ideology, you will probably also hear that he has ideas much like Yarvin, although he doesn't talk about it much. And so I just needed to get my Peter Thiel rant in on this episode, and we'll have that. Before we finish the facts and logic report, I do have one more story that, I mean, it's not a happy story, but it makes me happy, so let's end on that note. Cave divers on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula have found evidence of a mining operation started 12,000 years ago. It is thought that Mayas mined the cave for red ochre, a pigment associated with ancient painting.
But I've seen miracles in every way, and I see miracles every day.
If you listen, I don't think it was my last episode, maybe the episode I did where I talked about the Mormon archaeologist who was trying to turn Mayan temples and ruins into a Disneyland. I talked about this type of stuff. To this day, we're still uncovering things that the Maya left behind. This is a living monument to the history of a great civilization. And I suppose that is the end of the Facts and Logic Report.
Facts don't care about your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. These are facts.
And now we have my personal favorite segment I do often. We're gonna do another Libyan Civil War report. If you're new to the show, I'm going to give a brief overview, get you caught up on the Libyan Civil War. And since this is something I do talk about a lot, I do want to emphasize the impacts, because I do think this is one of the most geopolitically, maybe not interesting, but one of the most geopolitically implicated. It's one of the most important geopolitical events going on right now. Let me put it that way. It's up there with like the Syrian Civil War, I suppose, the conflicts with China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Those rank up there too, but this just does not get a lot of reporting. So let me get into it. There's two factions in the Libyan Civil War. The GNA, which is the UN-recognized government. The GNA, Government of National Accord, is supported by Turkey primarily. Then there's the Libyan National Army, also the LNA, which is led by Khalifa Haftar. And a lot of times I will just refer to them as Haftar's army or something like that, because GNA, LNA, those are all pretty similar sounding. The GNA, is primarily supported by Turkey. The LNA primarily supported by Egypt, but the LNA also gets they get diplomatic support from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and they've gotten some military support from Russian mercenaries. There are a lot more parties involved in this thing. It's pretty messy. So, a few weeks ago, the GNA recaptured the Al Watiya Air Base, a hugely important military base. It's both an important facility as well as being strategically located. So the GNA took Al Watiya, began pushing towards Sirte, a city in central Libya, which is, that's advancing right towards the LNA territory. As they began advancing on Sirte, Egypt made a military threat against the GNA that if they advanced any closer, they would use military force. So, where we last left off, Egypt was threatening to join the war and support the LNA and Haftar, and what that means is Turkey and Egypt are facing an imminent proxy war using Libya to better position themselves in the Middle East. Meanwhile, there are many different countries supporting different sides of the war for different reasons. The GNA is not only supported by Turkey, but, has at least the symbolic support from the UN, as well as some minor support from Italy, etc. I mean, really, if you look at the Wikipedia page for the Libyan Civil War, the second Libyan Civil War started 2014, the countries supporting which side truly seem random as hell. Like, France supports Haftar and the LNA. Italy supports the GNA. And that's only one example. Some of these you're like, what the hell? So, here are the most recent developments.
What's the buzz? Tell me what's happening.
France, like I said, kind of wants the LNA to win the civil war. But they're not involved in the war. If anything, it kind of seems like their support of the LNA is more of a grievance with Turkey than anything. For example, France has withdrawn from a NATO military operation where they patrol the seas. They did this because France claims Turkey broke a UN embargo and was transporting weapons to Libya. Turkey vehemently denied this and said that it was humanitarian aid that they were transporting. I mean, I kind of doubt it. I'm sure there were weapons in there, but who knows? The conflict, so the Libyan Civil War, and this conflict between France and Turkey overlaps heavily with Turkey's current claims to the Mediterranean Sea. Turkey is trying to claim the water space around Cyprus, around Syria, different parts of the Mediterranean, and France, Greece, especially as you'd imagine, those old Greeks with their grudge against Turks are really pissed off about this. But I'm not an expert on this. I just need to put it out there because that fight for the Mediterranean sea space is a looming issue on the broader Libyan civil war.
Eventually.
And finally, I mentioned the Al Watiya Air Force Base earlier. This was captured by the GNA a few weeks ago, after being controlled by the LNA for a long time. On July 5th, the LNA, Haftar's forces, backed by Egypt, conducted airstrikes on the airbase attempting to retake it. Meanwhile, Turkey is sending Syrian soldiers to fight for the GNA. The GNA and LNA have now established a new battle line between the cities of Misrata and the aforementioned Sirte. Egypt has repeated their threat, saying that they will engage militarily if the GNA attempts to seize Sirte. This wraps up the Libyan Civil War report for this episode. Not a ton has happened since last episode, but the conflict is still on the verge of boiling over into a full-blown global proxy war. And remember, Libya is in this situation because the Obama administration ruthlessly helped far-right Islamists assassinate the brotherly leader, Colonel Gaddafi, leader of the Libyan people. So, speaking of civil war, I do want to touch on the idea of civil war because this is something that right-wing Americans are absolutely freaking obsessed with, and I want to say much about it. I have a lot to say about it. This narrative is growing too much, and I don't use this lightly, but it is a completely fascistic impulse.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
There are two main reasons it's a fascistic impulse. First, it expresses a worldview of constantly being under siege and under attack. We're always one moment away from full-blown breakdown and societal collapse. This mentality enables authoritarianism pretty obviously, because eventually you'll feel that only a dictator can stave off these threats to society. I am the law! But more importantly, we have learned that they conceive the sides of the Civil War in a highly asymmetric way. The sides of the war aren't Republicans versus Democrats. It's not even right-wing militias versus Antifa or whatever. That's not the Civil War they imagine. The Civil War is between the state, its right-wing supporters, and the police, all united versus protesters. To them, that is the Civil War. Let's presuppose the Civil War actually was between right-wing militias and armed left-wing groups. This is not a civil war that would ever even happen. It would never happen because wars are fought because of access to resources, competition between economic powers, different economic systems, things like this. There's incentive with the most left-wing people to overthrow the U.S. government. There's also incentive with the most right-wing people to have a coup and take over the U.S. government. But anyone who actually already has power whatsoever has absolutely no motivation for a civil war. The only people who may have that motivation are negligible people in society. They don't have enough power to enable that. If you think Trump wants a civil war, you're out of your freaking gourd. He wants the U.S., he wants to control the most powerful empire possible, which he is doing right now. He doesn't want that empire to collapse. No one wants their source of power to collapse. Politicians don't want a civil war because, they control the most powerful country in the world. They don't want to undermine that power. It's really pretty self-explanatory. Not only that, but while America in general is polarized, politicians of the both parties still work hand in hand. So we see an increasingly polarized America, but that's not what politicians see. They are still buddies. Democrats and Republicans eating their tuna salad at the freaking Senate commissary. They don't see an impending civil war. They see things working as they always have.
You see how it works?
Also, American intelligence, the U.S. military, and the perpetual so-called deep state have no motivation for a civil war. Maybe even less than most politicians. They control the most powerful political apparatus in world history, and they don't even have to be elected.
We hold the world ransom for $100 billion.
American capitalists,
what?
As a third group,
what?
First talked about politicians,
what?
Then American intelligence,
what?
Capitalists don't want a civil war because they have the best arrangements in the world. No other government but the U.S. government gives their capitalist class a better deal. They are getting the best deal one could possibly get of any capitalist government you could conceive of. The point is, a civil war, as conventionally conceived, is frankly just impossible. None of the parties who could potentially wage war have any incentive to wage war.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing.
On the left, people talk about how revolution is basically impossible right now. There is no socialist revolutionary infrastructure. There isn't enough public sympathy with the revolutionary movement, etc. So while there might be some members of the American left who might be really unrealistic in anticipating a revolution, most of the left still gets that a revolution can't really happen right now.
Nope, not gonna work.
And the American right is way, way more unrealistic in anticipating a civil war. Because the whole American right is doing it, and they don't see that they don't think about it more than 5 seconds to see that it's the stupidest idea ever.
You shut up! You stupid idiots!
Because all of the Civil War baiting won't result in a civil war. They can talk about it as much as they want. Their prized Republican politicians aren't going to declare war for them if they just keep talking about it. But all the talking about it does have an impact. It's already had an impact. To the conservatives, they see their imagined civil war as an extension of their prized culture war.
You're a culture war warrior.
And let me let you in on something. No war has ever been fought because of culture. Ever. There's never been a war fought for culture. It's always been fought over the political control over material resources. Even the most culture-based wars you can think of, you have the Crusades and the 30 Years' War, the wars following Reformation. Those were religious wars, and even those were fought primarily for political control over land and resources. The Crusades was to control the highly desirable land around religious monuments and artifacts. They wanted the territory. They didn't care. The religion part was subsequent to controlling the land. The 30 Years' War, the war between the Reformation and the Catholics, that was a control for political power over Europe. Up until then, the Pope was almost like a indirect second-hand king for, you needed the Pope's approval to make someone like the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, for example. The Pope had tremendous political power. The 30 Years' War and the Reformation, or the wars that followed the Reformation, were wars to take away the political power of the Pope. Civil wars are never the extension of a culture war, because dominant classes, the capitalist class in our case, don't actually care about culture that much. Rich people don't have culture. Sorry, folks. It's true. Rich people don't have culture. They're cultureless. All they know is money. That is their culture. Instead, and this is my main point that I'm getting at, a culture war can escalate into violence, but that violence won't ever be symmetric and warlike. It won't be like troops lining up in a battlefield meeting. Okay, we're gonna hash out this culture war. We want to tear down the monuments and you don't. Let's battle. That does not happen. When a culture war escalates into the violence, it's not a war. It's just street fighting and terroristic violence. All of the tensions that exist in our society will continue to escalate because nothing is being done to alleviate these tensions. As that happens, more police will use more violence against protesters. More right-wing nut jobs will plow their cars through protesters like little cowards.
You coward.
And there will be an increased amount of violence, and it will come from the state and the far-right elements that are empowered by the state. That means the Civil War, as it can possibly exist, has already started. Which is to say, there isn't a Civil War, but if there is one, the war is cops and right-wing nut jobs protecting capitalist interests against protesters. The right-wing side is allowed to attack the left-wing side. And then on the other hand, if the left-wing side even shows up peacefully, they may be gassed, beaten, arrested, or killed. So that's what the so-called American Civil War II is. Police beating and killing protesters. The state repressing dissidents isn't and has never been a war. It's just plain straightforward state repression.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
That they frame as a war because they see themselves as on the side of the cop.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
I got another culture war issue for you here, folks. I want to talk a little bit about K-pop stans.
And the winner is a movie from South Korea.
So, recently, there was a lot of discourse about K-pop online and what the political inclination of K-pop stans may be. You know, lots of tweets like, will K-pop stans end up being left-wing or right-wing? Who can say? Which side will they join? Then stories came out about K-pop fans making fake reservations to Trump's rally, reserving tickets so other people couldn't go.
We got enough problems with South Korea with trade.
And then some people on Twitter were like, yay, the K-pop stans picked a side. Yay, they picked the right side. Now, I'm not usually one to take memes too seriously, and maybe that's what I'm doing right now, but I have to say the framing of this issue just doesn't really pertain to reality. It's a bad way to conceptualize political alliances because it's a culture-based way to conceptualize political alliances. People aren't subdivided into little gangs that then choose a political side. They choose a political side based on their socioeconomic positioning, what propaganda they've been exposed to, how they're socialized, their personal principles, etc. What type of music you like do not inform those things. Your average K-pop fan, or at least the ones you come across on Twitter, are usually high school, maybe college age girls. Many of them are people of color. In other words, your average K-pop fan, at least in America, is like the exact demographic that's most likely to be left-wing. The average teenage girl K-pop fan isn't left-wing because she likes K-pop. She is left-wing because she's a teenage girl, which is also the target demographic of K-pop. A similar thing happened back in, 2017, when Juggalos went to march in Washington.
Magic everywhere in this bitch.
I don't know if that march actually went through. I'm assuming it did. But what happened is online, everyone was like, whoa, the Juggalos are radicalizing. Whoa, the Juggalos are woke and political now. And that's just the most naive and short-sighted thing I can imagine. Juggalos are almost universally poor working-class people. Now, they are primarily white, I imagine, but it is multiracial, and Juggalos are actually pretty vocally open to diversity, and they pride themselves on being welcoming to all people. That is pretty typical of working class movements. Working class people are not nearly as exclusionary as middle class people. And for that reason, it makes complete sense that the Juggalos would generally be mostly left-wing. But I imagine most Juggalos have the political views that most working-class white people have, which is to say, they don't think about politics that much, they have a lot of left-wing views, but they also have a lot of uninterrogated right-wing views, especially for social issues. They're kind of naive, so they might have these kind of backwards views that they've never thought about, but they still hold them, but are ultimately pretty sympathetic to redistributive and, left-wing economic policies. What I'm getting at is the impact of all this is when you see a group of people, first as, say, an ICP fan or a K-pop fan, it is making politics into this sort of culture war political theater, and that's exactly where we don't want people to go. We don't want people to organize politically as if they're mods and rockers going to a street fight. We want them to organize politically based on their class. The cultural element matters, obviously, but it shouldn't be emphasized in the politics. The politics should be, we want everyone to have a better, more equitable, more socialized life, independent of any cultural elements. We don't even see your culture as long as you're on our side. Cultures would exist in the social sphere. In the political sphere, we're talking about economic issues. Because we're poor people and we want more money.
I have a structured settlement and I need cash now. Call J.G. Wentworth, 877 cash now.
We want more rights. We want the fruits of our labor. That is the more helpful, direct, left-wing political orientation, rather than viewing it as a bunch of subcultures picking sides.
Water, fire, air, and dirt. Fucking
fucking magnets. How do they work?
And one more segment for this episode. This one's really going into a culture war issue that pisses me the frick off. I don't know if you guys know anything. Sorry, I feel like I'm a little more angry than I normally am on this episode.
A certain hand gesture with one finger.
So, I don't know if you guys know the YouTube channel. It's called Rising on the Hill, or Rising on the Hill YouTube channel. It's with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, I think. Basically, the way the show's framed is Crystal Ball is a left populist, Sagar is a right populist. Now, you may have, if you listen to the show, you know I rail against the idea of a right populist. To me, it means absolutely nothing. And in fact, I'm going to play some clips from their show where they talk about Chinese influence in Hollywood movies. I'm going to try to debunk their culture war bait, but I think throughout it, Sagar spells out very clearly what a right-wing populist is, especially at the end, because he makes some remark about just like, they're like, oh, what solution could we have? And he's just like, ban it. Ban all Chinese interference, ban it. That's what that is the essential character of a right-wing populist, just this authoritarian streak.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
But we'll get to that. I'm going to play some clips.
So these films are not only critical to the studio's bottom line, but to one of their most important relationships. That's the Chinese government. So the Federalist cultural reporter Emily Jashinsky recently wrote about Hollywood and Chinese cozy relationship and why 2020 could permanently change it.
Nope, not going to work.
So Emily joins us now via Skype to kind of discuss her piece. Good to see you, Em. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about this observation. I mean, something I've highlighted here now for a long time about how there's all this Chinese money that goes into these Hollywood studios, which creates this feedback loop because the Hollywood studios want to, please their funders, and they want to be able to enter Chinese markets, so they sometimes self-censor. Why will 2020 make it even worse?
What you say? Yeah, I mean, I reported this story out in January, late December and early January, so it was right before things really got crazy.
Crazy.
Our relationship with China and with Hollywood's relationship with China. I mean, theater chains have been shut for months now, not just here in this country, but overseas, and that's creating like some incredible financial constraints for them. So it makes that Chinese market even more important to their bottom line.
In this clip, they just spell out the reason China has any input in Hollywood, and it's the bottom line. It's all about the money.
It's all about the money. It's all about the dum-dum-da-da-dum-dum. I don't think it's funny.
But it's interesting that they mention this right up top as just like a preamble to whatever angle they're going to take. This is actually part of the conservative worldview. For whatever reason, they acknowledge economic underpinnings when they want to. They know that it's there, but they dismiss it as just kind of like a political footnote, when it's the whole note. It is the note. They know the economic underpinnings are there, but they just kind of don't care. And they made it clear in this clip that they get it, but they ignore what they get and just go straight for the culture war bait.
And why we should be concerned that the Chinese market is so important to their bottom line is because it means that they censor scripts. In the story that I reported out, I talked to a Hollywood executive. His name is Chris Fenton, who mentioned that actually some of these scripts are censored before they're even written. Scriptwriters in Hollywood know now not to make China the enemy of any movie, and to include certain things in their films or not. I mean, Bohemian Rhapsody was censored just last year. Some of the gay part of the storyline were taken out so that it could be shown in Chinese theaters. So that's where you see this relationship with China becoming problematic. And also, let's remember, Hollywood doesn't want to do business in the state of Georgia after they publish, after they pass an anti-abortion law. Well, okay, the Chinese government is repressing Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps.
Right.
So there's all
stealing
kinds
their
of
kidneys, but that's fine.
Right. Yeah. No. Who cares about that?
Stealing kidneys? Really, bro? Like, you're just gonna regurgitate Falun Gong talking points? That is so lame, dude.
You've memorized a bunch of talking points.
Anyway, a couple things about this clip. First, I'll get it out of the way. Yeah, China does have control over content in Hollywood movies. I'm not denying that, and I don't really have any incentive to deny it. It's just true. I mean, well, they at least have control if the movies are going to be released in China. But what they never mention they actually do mention this at the end. We'll get to that. But what they barely mention is the U.S. government, American capitalists, and the American dominant class have way more control over Hollywood than China has. Their only real aggrievement is they want American movies to be controlled by American capitalists and to have American propaganda. She also brings up the example of Bohemian Rhapsody and does a sleight of hand. So, Bohemian Rhapsody was censored in China, but it was not censored in America. I repeat, she claims they took gay scenes out of Bohemian Rhapsody to appease China. In reality, America and most of the world released the full version. Big thunder. I'm in a thunderstorm right now. So, as I was saying, they took the gay scenes out of Bohemian Rhapsody to appease China, but those were not taken out of every version of the movie. She makes it seem like they took those scenes out of the whole movie, every movie, like those scenes don't exist anymore to appease China. But in reality, an American will likely never see the censored version. They have no reason to. This seems like a purposeful sleight of hand because when the movie came out, there was a backlash in the gay community against Bohemian Rhapsody. And the reason is the movie, in general, de-emphasized Freddie Mercury's sexuality, and that's before any Chinese censorship. They completely de-emphasize Freddie Mercury's sexuality and even portrays gay sex as the sort of tempestuous sin that he becomes allured by. So it's not a particularly pro-gay movie. Wow, I don't know if you hear that, but it's hailing right now too. Wow. But so what Emily Jahinsky is trying to vaguely do here, vaguely tie the controversy about the movie's portrayal of gay people into her grievance about the Chinese government. She's trying to tie these together, make you think they're connected, so that China becomes the target of queer grievances, not America. When in reality, it was Western movie makers who decided to de-emphasize the homosexuality element of the movie at all, and then China just took out the little bits that they did leave in the movie. And on top of all of that, within China, the censorship was criticized. Chinese movie fans were vocally and publicly opposed to the change. They want to make it out like this amorphous Chinese mob all hate the gays and force us to take gay people out of our movies. When that's just not true at all. Chinese people did not like this change, Chinese moviegoers. Also, the idea about Hollywood not filming in Georgia, that really doesn't mean anything. It's pure just deflection. Yes, there were movie studios who said they wouldn't film in Georgia to protest their anti-abortion laws. But it really doesn't matter because Georgia is still one of the biggest states for film production. So what she's really complaining about is not the material reality of where the Hollywood industry films, but rather she's just complaining about liberal hypocrisy. And I'm increasingly more and more convinced that your average American conservative is only conservative because of liberal hypocrisy. It always comes back to that for them. Your average dumb conservative wouldn't believe most of the shit they believe if they weren't like, oh, Bernie Sanders flew in a plane, but he wants to take away my plane? What? That's not fair. Hypocrites.
Attention all libtards. Farted and I had an accident in my pants.
And finally, I just have to make the obvious point that there's a difference between Hollywood pre-editing themselves to make sure their movie can be released in a foreign market and not filming somewhere. There's really no parallel between Georgia's role in Hollywood and China's role in Hollywood.
Right. Well, and I think that's part of it too, is it's easy to underplay just how much this changes not only the content of the films, but which films are even greenlit to start with because of how important and how large the Chinese market is. So just talk a little bit about that piece of it.
Yeah, so there's a quota as to how many films, American films, can be showed at the Chinese box office in a given year. But what that means is Hollywood has incentive to pour a lot of money into movies that they know will be shown in China and will do well in China. And you know, this is in certain cases we see, you know, American films targeted to certain demographics in this country that they know will come out to the box office and make decisions, artistic decisions because of that. But at the same time, I mean, the film industry, American film, has such a proud history of political expression. And this is one of the most important political topics right now is our relationship with China. And in the world is China's relationship with its own people. It's totally off limits to Hollywood right now unless it's venerating the Chinese government. Totally off limits.
There's a lot of contradictory points here. For one, like she said, there's a quota on Hollywood movies that get theatrical releases in China. There's only supposed to be 34 foreign movies released in Chinese theaters a year. Some years it's higher, like I saw in 2017 it was 40. They do bend the rules, but you get the idea. Not all of those movies are Hollywood movies, all of those 34. So let's say 30 Hollywood movies are released by conventional methods in China per year. You would presume that very few movies even try to crack the Chinese market. In other words, why are there more than 30 movies a year catering to China if they won't even be allowed there?
Best foreign movie!
If there are more than 30 or 40 or so movies a year that cater to Chinese audiences, that's a Hollywood problem, not a China problem. They're trying to get something that they may or may not get. And even if they don't get it, we still get a presumably, but I'm not convinced, a so-called inferior product. The issue is, Hollywood creates movies with as broad of an appeal as possible. Pretty common sense, right? And the reason they're increasingly making more bad movies isn't China. It's because bad movies have mass appeal and therefore make a lot of money. This only becomes apparent when China has different tastes in bad movies than we do. For example, Transformers: Age of Extinction and Warcraft made a lot of money, a lot more money in China than North America. And people blame the Chinese market for liking these shitty-ass movies. However, well, I take that back. I actually thought Warcraft was a pretty good movie. I mean, I am a fan of the Warcraft universe, but I didn't see why it was so hated. I'd watch it again.
You are not prepared.
However, those same people don't complain when the Avengers movies succeed at a similar level in both Chinese and American box offices. I consider that just as crappy of a movie as freaking Transformers. But we don't talk about it that way because white people like Avengers as well as Chinese people. And then similarly, there are some bad movies like the Disney Star Wars movies. I really wanted to emphasize that. The Disney Star Wars movies suck. But they actually do terribly in China. People in China don't like the Disney Star Wars. But we don't blame Americans for liking crap movies. This creates a dynamic where whenever a bad movie does well in China, the American press sneers at China for their crappy taste, but whenever a bad movie doesn't do well in China, it is either underreported and ignored, or, in fact, also turned against China.
One of the things that makes me really sad about this is that the movies that get greenlit are these, stuff blowing up, things, the jokes have to make sense on a very baseline level because they have to appeal to a non-American audience. And it creates kind of like a mass consumerist culture. And it kind of removes kind of the things that made them American in the first place, which is that films in which the whole country could rally around. And now it's made for world consumption, which just kind of dilutes that. What impact do you think that has on all of us? Because I think film is really important.
Here, Sagar shows his authoritarian ass by making it clear that he actually wants American movies to be American propaganda. He wants movies to be something that Americans rally behind. Sagar, he's kind of right that American movies are made for world consumption. But where he's wrong is that's how Hollywood always has been. American movies are and have been one of the most ubiquitous cultural exports in the world. Movies aren't made for non-Americans any more than they were in like the 70s. They were still making movies for international audiences in the 70s. People worldwide were seeing American movies a lot. The difference is there's a lot more money to be made in international audiences now. And the even bigger difference than that is there's now national film industries to compete with Hollywood. So if Chinese movies speak to Chinese audiences more than American movies, then Hollywood, as a capitalist institution, isn't making that sweet, sweet money. It's all about the money.
It's all about the money. It's all about the dum dum da da dum dum. I don't think it's funny.
Yeah, that's another really good point. It's like you mentioned, the jokes. They have to be able to land in Chinese movie theaters, which makes it a totally different experience. For the people who are making these movies, of course, they have to now think about not just what Americans are going to laugh at. And this isn't for every movie, but it's for a lot of movies, and especially those big budget films where a lot of money is poured into, like Mulan is a very good example. Disney is in a really tricky situation because they put a lot of money into Mulan. They tried to gear it towards Chinese audiences in a way that would make them a ton of money in the Chinese box office. But even then, there's been controversy about whether they did that correctly. So probably the most prominent controversy with this right now is with Top Gun. Is it a huge deal to the artistic integrity of the film that they took the Taiwanese flag off of Maverick's bomber jacket? No, you probably wouldn't notice it if it wasn't pointed out by conservative media. But at the same time, it's a matter of principle. This is one of the biggest issues when we talk about our relationship with China, Hollywood's relationship with China. Our Pentagon spent a lot of, collaborated with the makers of Top Gun. And then they took the Taiwanese flag off the bomber jacket. The Pentagon uses Hollywood movies as training exercises and PR in some cases, and that collaboration I think is extremely problematic. So is it a big deal that the Taiwanese flag isn't on Maverick's bomber jacket? No, but there's other things that we're not even noticing because we don't know what's getting left on the cutting room floor, or even not even, like, this is the scariest thing, is what people aren't even putting into their scripts, the ideas that they aren't even coming up with because they know it will never get greenlit by a major.
So in this clip, they just outright acknowledge that the Pentagon interferes in Hollywood, and Emily Jahinsky doesn't have any issue with it. In fact, she frames it as if the Pentagon and Chinese government are collaborating to make movies. Ooh, isn't that a scary cabal? Which is just the most absolute joke of an idea ever. It's more like the Pentagon and the Chinese government and dozens of other forces all have an input into the movie-making process. Some of these forces have more influence on some movies than others. Most movies are never touched by either the Chinese government or the Pentagon, and in fact, virtually no movies are influenced by both China and the Pentagon. I mean, there are superhero... I actually don't know that for sure. I don't know. The extent of all this isn't that public or even that measurable, but the idea that they're collaborating, the Pentagon and the China are collaborating to make American movies shittier is just the most like dog crap for brains take I can imagine. And then the obvious thing I have to point about this, the first Top Gun movie is an absolute garbage trash movie. And that was made way before China had any influence in Hollywood.
Really
but what is honestly the answer here? Because, I mean, we're focused on China. I think that's important because that's a significant global issue that affects our politics here and geopolitics all around the world. But what you're really describing is just capitalism. I mean, playing to the mass market, the lowest common denominator. You know, I thought Trolls 2, which was Trolls 1 I actually kind of liked. Trolls 2 was a terrible movie. And yet it does amazing because it hits this point of like, you know, it's sort of accessible and bubblegummy for everyone. So like, what is the answer to that?
Yeah, so my perspective is that the answer is more capitalism. And I would encourage American consumers to start making their demands known and saying, you know, I'm not going to go to Top Gun 2 if you take the Taiwanese flag off the bomber jacket.
I knew this. I knew her libertarian streak was coming. I have another idea. Ban it. Ban it.
Well, Ted Cruz is trying to. He's a conservative. Ted Cruz is trying to prevent the Pentagon from working on films where there's censorship on behalf of the Chinese government. The Chinese censors have to look at scripts and everything before the movies are shown in the Chinese box office. So Ted Cruz does have a bill, which I support. I think that's an important bill. But I would also just encourage American consumers to not patronize movies that are going to do this BS.
So by the end, we're left with three basic ideological positions about how to go forward. Crystal Ball rightfully points out more or less what I've been getting at, namely that this is just the natural consequence of capitalism. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Sagar shows his authoritarian ass again, where he just wants it banned, which is like, okay, dude, cool idea, whatever. And then Emily Jahinsky says more capitalism is the answer, which I take it back. That is way more of a dog crap for brains take than even her last one. There's no possible explanation of how that could be true. If you're claiming capitalism will solve this quote-unquote issue, it really just shows you don't understand what capitalism is. But let's take that claim on face value. What she's advocating for is the middle class becoming radicalized in a consumer sphere. I want to talk about the nature of the middle class more in depth at some point, but for now I'll just explain a little bit what I personally mean by that. The middle class in the United States is disappearing. We all know that. Many people who are very poor even identify as middle class because they still prescribe to, well, I mean, usually it's because they're naive, or they still prescribe to socio-economic paradigms from like the 70s. So, because of that, since the middle class is now so small and people choose to identify it to convey a point rather than it just being informed by income most of the time, practically speaking, the middle class are working class people who identify more as consumers than they identify as workers. She's advocating for politically activated. She's advocating for people becoming politically activated, but politically activated as a consumer. So her idea of using capitalism to counter Chinese influence in movies is pretty simple. It's see movies that don't have influence from China and don't see movies that do have influence from China. But that's not even a political act. That's just simple consumer preference. But middle class people can't conceive of actual disruptive political acts. They hardly even can conceive of politics. It's all just culture to them.
You're a culture war warrior.
This mentality is obviously detrimental to advancing working class causes. But by all means, please, if you're a conservative and listening to this, please stop saying movies made for China. The movie industry will become infinitely better if you stop watching Marvel movies. But the real irony of all of this is we all know these ineffectual and pointless capitalist-loving chuds are absolutely going to continue to see the same dumb movies. It's just the most hollow political gesture possible to be like, oh, your consumer choices will stop Chinese influence in American movies. No, it's not going to stop anything because the Chinese market, if it's not already, is already bigger than the United States. Sorry to tell you that, folks, but Hollywood is not making movies for us anymore. And it will remain that way as long as capitalism exists. And then, so on top of the fact that her idea of political activism is just the most hollow crap ever, the truly ironic part is everyone knows no one's going to follow through with her advice. These dumbasses are just going to keep seeing the same shit movies over and over again. They are the ones who see those movies. In this situation, you could say I'm defending Hollywood and China, although I'm really not. I'm just simply saying that this is not a cultural issue, it's an economic issue. Even me, who's in that position, I don't watch these stupid freaking movies that they're talking about. But they do, and they have an issue with it. So what the hell's going on? They just want to complain. And then, just to close out, then they talk about Ted Cruz's bill. Basically, Ted Cruz would prohibit the Pentagon from working on a movie that China is also working on. This is an actual potential solution. I mean, it's a dumb solution, but it's a lot more well considered than stop watching bad movies and then we'll change the world together. Yay! Sorry. I feel like I have a really ticked off attitude this episode, but I think the U.S. perpetually overestimates its true cultural power at the moment. And I think if Ted Cruz made Hollywood into a turf war between the Pentagon and China, well, China is going to win a lot more than Ted Cruz thinks it will. And with that, I think that's about the end of our show. I hope you got more insight into what a culture war is, why culture wars are bad, why conservatives love culture wars. This is not the type of topics I usually like to talk about. If you listened to the show before, you know I'm way more interested international, geopolitical, economic, strange, supernatural stories like that. These stories are more the type of things that I always see but don't want to talk about, but other people talk about. I want to use this episode to once and for all be like, shut the hell up about your culture war crap. Having said that, thank you for listening to The Society Show. My name is Christian Patterson. You can follow me on Twitter at ChristianIsCool. Christian IZ Cool is spelled IZ. Or you can follow me on the Twitter account for this podcast at society_show. And finally, you can email the podcast. I would love to get any type of feedback, topics to talk about, corrections, anything like that. The email address is societyshowpodcast@gmail.com. And now that that's out of the way, thank you for listening to The Society Show.
Society. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other.
On the next Arrested Development.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
That is nasty. As a man who looks like he bathes in Cheeto dust.
My dad says butane's a bastard gas.
That's history right there, you understand?